Sigurd Eysteinsson is perhaps one of the most formidable Viking warlords to have ever reached the shores of Scotland, with his entire legacy focusing on the many conquests and raids he would partake in throughout his turbulent life. Sigurd Eysteinsson, better remembered to history as Sigurd the Mighty, would establish Norse dominion over vast swathes of northern Scotland during the late 9th century, conquering Caithness and Sutherland through a campaign of relentless warfare, earning him much fame and glory and many Viking sagas and tales. His exploits in subduing the Pictish tribes and expanding Norse influence across the Scottish mainland would cement his reputation as one of the most successful Viking leaders of his generation. However, despite the glory Sigurd achieved and the vast territories he had under his dominion, his life would end not in the heat of glorious battle, nor through the blade of a worthy adversary, but in a manner so bizarre and ignoble that it would become one of the most unique and memorable deaths in all of Viking history, as he would be killed by an individual that was already dead. But how exactly could such an event occur, and what were the circumstances leading up to the death of Sigurd the Mighty? To answer these questions, we will analyze the medieval text, the Orkneyinga Saga, Heimskringla, and the Historia Norwegiae to better understand how exactly did Sigurd Eysteinsson meet his brutal, painful, and unexpected death. But before we begin, don't forget, if you want to find out more about the deaths of some of history's greatest figures, then subscribe to my channel, Historical Exit. The circumstances surrounding Sigurd's demise began with what appeared to be yet another routine conflict with the indigenous Pictish rulers, who continued to resist Norse expansion into their ancestral lands. According to medieval sources, Sigurd found himself locked in a dispute with a local chieftain named Mael Brigte the Bucktoothed, a Pictish nobleman whose distinctive dental features would prove to be far more significant than anyone could have possibly imagined. The Orkneyinga Saga records that this conflict escalated when Mael Brigte challenged Sigurd to settle their differences through honorable combat, proposing a battle with 40 men on each side in accordance with the warrior traditions of the age. However, Sigurd's response would reveal the treacherous nature that had served him so well in his conquests, as he arrived at the appointed battlefield with twice the agreed number of warriors, bringing 80 men instead of the promised 40. This act of deception would seal Mael Brigte's fate, but it would also set in motion the chain of events that would lead to Sigurd's own downfall in the most extraordinary circumstances imaginable. The battle itself was swift and decisive, with Mael Brigte's outnumbered forces standing little chance against Sigurd's overwhelming numerical advantage. However, though, the Pictish warriors fought valiantly, but they were quickly overwhelmed and slaughtered, with Mael Brigte himself falling victim to the blades of the Vikings. Following this victory, in accordance with Viking custom, Sigurd ordered the heads of his fallen enemies to be severed and attached to their saddles as trophies of their triumph. Sigurd claimed Mael Brigte's head for himself, fastening it to his own saddle as the ultimate symbol of his decisive victory over the Pictish chieftain. But this simple act of riding a horse with the head attached to the saddle would have deadly consequences for Sigurd the Mighty, as the Orkneyinga Saga records Sigurd strapped the head to his saddle as a trophy, but as Sigurd rode, Mael Brigte's buck tooth scratched his leg. The leg became inflamed and infected, and as a result, Sigurd died. Therefore, it would seem that while Sigurd and his men were riding triumphantly through the Scottish countryside, the dangling head of Mael Brigte would bounce against Sigurd's leg with each movement of his horse, and the dead chieftain's prominent bucktooth would eventually scrape against the exposed flesh on Sigurd's leg, creating what initially appeared to be nothing more than just a minor scratch. The Historia Norwegiae describes the fatal moment. On the way, as Sigurd went to spur his horse, he struck his calf against his tooth sticking out of Mael Brigte's mouth, and it gave him a scratch. The wound began to swell and ache, and it was this that led to the death of Sigurd the Powerful. This passage highlights that the superficial wound would become inflamed and infected in the days that followed, with infection spreading through Sigurd's leg, with most modern historians agreeing that either sepsis or gangrene were the primary culprits in the death of Sigurd the Mighty. However, though, the irony of Sigurd's death was not lost on the saga writers, all of whom were writing hundreds of years after the event, but they all recognized the poetic justice inherent in a treacherous warrior being killed by the very trophy he had claimed through deception. The Heimskringla also further corroborates the accounts found in the Historia Norwegiae and the Orkneyinga Saga, highlighting that Mael Brigte achieved in death what he could not accomplish in life, the destruction of his Viking tormentor Sigurd the Mighty. Therefore, it is ironic and quite surprising to accept that Sigurd Eysteinsson, the conqueror of kingdoms and the terror of the Scottish Highlands, was brought low not by a sword or a spear, but by the posthumous bite of a dead man's tooth, making him perhaps the only warrior in history to be killed in such a manner. And for generations, the tale of Sigurd the Mighty's death would serve as a cautionary reminder for all Vikings that treachery and deception, even when successful in the short term, could lead to consequences that defied all reasonable expectation. So I really hope you enjoyed this video on the death of Sigurd Eysteinsson. And if you did find it to be educational and enjoyable, then please do share this video with others. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe to my channel, Historical Exit, so you can find out more about the deaths of some of history's greatest figures. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day. Bye.